Example 1. In this example, we'll work on some data showing the sales from a 12-month period. The first step is to select the data table with the row and column headings. Then, from the Insert tab, select the first style of column chart. The chart appeared in the worksheet while I was hovering over it with the mouse cursor, but it is only added after actually clicking on the icon. Now I'll drag the added graph next to the table by left-clicking on it and dragging it. We can also change the size of the chart by dragging any of the circles on the corners or sides. If we hover over one of them with the cursor, an arrow appears that allows us to change the size of the chart. For beginners and those who don't want to overcomplicate things, the styles Excel offers will be the most convenient for you. Then, after clicking on Color, you can choose from the color palette. In this example, I'll make all the bars the same color because there is only one data series in the graph. But in this lesson, I'm going to show you how to have control over every element of the chart. So let's go back to the original style. I'll press undo 3 times over. The most convenient way to undo is by holding down the left control key and simultaneously pressing the letter Z key. By default, Excel adds grid lines, but we can remove them by selecting them and pressing the delete key on the keyboard. Let's also add data labels. Right-click on any data bar, then select Add Data Labels. To change the title, double-click on it. We'll enter the title Sales 2019, then increase the font size and embolden it. Next, we'll replace the months with their abbreviations. The appropriate list is in the data table. If we click once on any bar, it will select all the bars. You know that they are selected because they have small circles on the corners. The source of the data for the graph is also marked. We can drag a border to a different place like this, holding onto the side. Drag the data descriptions below the abbreviated month names. After dragging, as soon as you release the mouse, the descriptions on the graph change. As you can see, the data for the graph doesn't have to be located close to the descriptions. If you do not want the abbreviated month names to be visible, the simplest way to get rid of them is to change their font color to white. The next step is to increase the bar width. Double-click on the bars and the Format Data Series tab appears. Then under the tab, set the width of the gap between the bars to 50%. Close the tab by clicking on the cross in the upper right-hand corner. After left-clicking on any of the labels, we can format them using the commands under the Home tab. Let's increase the font size to 10. 2 single clicks on the selected label allows us to just format this label by itself. This helps to draw the attention of those who will be viewing your graph to this label. I suggest increasing the font and emboldening. We can format the bars in the same way. For example, select all of them with one click and choose a new color, or select a single bar with 2 single clicks and assign it with a different color. When choosing colors, I suggest avoiding the saturated colors and contrasting color combinations. You can find out more on this topic in the Advanced Professional Reports lesson. For most purposes, this graph is now finished. But we could add a trend line. To do this, click on the plus symbol, then click on the arrow next to trend line and select More Options. The Format Trend Line window will be displayed. For most data, like sales in subsequent years, the linear trend is the best option. In our example, we are more interested in determining the sales profile, or seasonality, so we'll use the polynomial trend, order 5. To format the trend line, click on the paint can icon and we'll reduce the width of the trend line to 1 and select a dash type under the line section. This is done to make the trend line only slightly visible, as not to dominate the basic data in the chart. The fact that the sales in October stand out above the seasonality represented by the trend line is visible at first glance. Creating other charts based on the same pattern. Now we'll create a chart in the same format for the sales in units. The data and descriptions that we want to prepare a new chart for are on the same worksheet, in cells B29 to C41. We can repeat all the operations I've shown you before, But because people are lazy by nature, we'll use a faster solution. Select the graph prepared earlier and copy it using Ctrl+C. Choose a cell next to the units table, for example cell E29, and paste the chart there using Ctrl+V. Then click on one of the bars of the new chart, selecting the entire data series. Then above, in the sales table, the data used by the graph is marked with the blue rectangle. Left-click on any side of the blue rectangle and drag it down to the table with the sales in units. After releasing the mouse, the graph will automatically show the new data. This is very useful when we have to create many graphs with the same format. So we can prepare one and copy it many times, and then for each of them drag the data source area to the appropriate range. All that's left to do is to change the title. The scale of the vertical axis is adjusted automatically unless we have changed the scale manually in the original graph. Charts can also be copied onto other worksheets or into other files. In other words, if we have a chart in a format that we like, creating a new one is a waste of time. It's better to just copy an existing one and change the data source. When working with graphs copied from other worksheets or files, we need to change the data source differently. Right-click on the graph and select Select Data. Click on the Edit button on the left to choose the right source of data for the graph. Then click on the Edit button on the right to choose the source of the axis labels. Adjusting the scope of the data. If the graph we create has a different amount of values or series of data, we can change the size of the area that the data is taken from. To do this, click on the data series and, after the rectangles with the data sources are displayed, adjust the size of the area by dragging one of the corners so that it encompasses the area you want. To practice this process, you can limit the graph to the first half of the year. Example 2. Worksheet Graphs 2. In order to show the data presented in the table in the best possible way, a graph with two vertical axes should be used. We'll start by selecting a table with headings. Also, selecting the sum of the data is a common mistake. The graph containing the sum would be unclear, as all the other bars would be too small to see the differences between them. From the Insert tab, select the line graph and its first subtype. The graph automatically prepared by Excel won't be anywhere near a finished product for the standards we require. The margin, as a percentage, is shown on the same vertical axis as the sales, and the line representing the margin is on the x-axis. Right-click on the sales line and select Format Data Series. In the series options, change the axis from primary to secondary and close the window. As a result, a second vertical axis has been added on the right-hand side of the graph. The left axis shows the values for the margin, and the right one shows the sales. If for some reason you prefer to have the sales on the left and the margin on the right, the last operation should be performed for the line representing the margin. Because the margin line is on the x-axis, clicking on it precisely and avoiding the axis requires a bit of patience. It'll be much easier to analyze the graph once the lines no longer cross in so many places. Next, we will change the maximum for the axis corresponding to the sales data. Double-click on the axis and open the Format Axis tab, entering the value of 1600 as the maximum. The sales values haven't changed, but because the axis is now larger, the graph is shown underneath and does not cross the margin line. At this point, it's much easier to analyze the correlation between the margin and the sales. Let's now give the chart a title, Margin and Sales in 2019. You can also format the title, for example by emboldening it. Select Graph and change the font color of all the fonts to black for a professional finish. I suggest removing the horizontal grid lines. To do so, select them and press the Delete key on your keyboard. Then drag the legend to the plot area and change the size of the plot area. The chart can now be considered finished. The second option for the same chart is to combine the line graph and the bar graph. To do this, move the legend outside of the plot area. Click on the line showing the sales and select the bar chart and the first of its subtypes from the Insert menu. Before you click on it, Excel will preview what the graph will look like. The last thing to add is a decreasing gap between bars. Double-click on the bars, and in the Format Data Series window, change the gap width to 50%. Exercise 2 is done. Example 3. Worksheet Graphs 3. In this example, the aim is to show the sales and the orders data on one graph. Both of the values are in millions, but the sales are in hundreds of millions, and the orders have values ranging from 1 to 2 million. Therefore, it's not possible to show both sets of data on a standard line graph. If we try to do it, the line representing the orders would be fairly flat and close to zero, which would not give us the opportunity to analyze its volatility. In addition, it would be good to have both the months and the quarters on the x-axis scale. The graph of choice is linear with two axes. Select the entire data area with the row and column headings, and from the Insert tab, select the line chart and choose the first subtype. Excel automatically dealt with one of our problems. The x-axis has clear double descriptions. The first step we have to make is to add a second axis. We know how to do it from the previous example. The side effect of adding a second axis is that the plot area becomes narrower and the chart is therefore unclear. The graph will be a little bit clearer when the grid lines are deleted. Unfortunately, the lines still overlap and cross many times. Additionally, there are dozens of zeros in the units on the axis, making everything look unprofessional. A double click on the right axis displays the Format Axis window, where you will find Display Units, then select Millions. Now the descriptions make no sense, as there are a lot of ones, for example. Scroll down and click on Number, then add a decimal place. Repeat the process of changing the display units for the second vertical axis. On the scale, we already have clear numbers, but the graphs still overlap, so we have to set the maximum at 3.5e8. The text 3.5e8 means 3.5 times 10 to the power of 8, or 350 million. Also, move the legend to the plot area, enlarge the plot area, get rid of the border, enter the title, and do some more formatting. If it's obvious to all the people that will use this chart that the data is in millions, we can erase this information, gaining some more space to increase the plot area into. Some people also like to see the axes. To add them, double-click on any of the values on the scales, and in the Format Axis window, select the Fill tab, and then Solid Line, and change the line color to black, for example. Of course, all of the axes should be consistent. Keep the Format Axis window open and change the axis selection and select black solid line for all of them. Example 4. Sheet Graphs 4. This example involves a pie chart containing information about the stock levels of 4 products according to their value. First, select the table, and under the Insert tab, choose the first of the 2D pie chart subtypes. 2D charts are easier to read, but due to their attraction, 3D charts have become more popular nowadays, and often they are expected by the recipients of these kinds of reports. Finding products based on the small squares with the corresponding colors from the legend is quite tiring. It's also important to remember that the recipients of our reports could have problems in distinguishing similar colors. To avoid this issue, click on the plus sign, deselect Legend, click on the arrow next to Data Labels, tick Outside End, and then More Options. In the Format Data Labels window, select Category Name so that we know which section of the pie applies to which product. Then Value and Percentage so that the share of the product will also be calculated and displayed. By default, the Show Leading Lines option is also selected. It's useful for pie charts with many segments, whereby the leading lines join the labels to the slices. The three messages on the labels are separated by commas, which is adjustable under the Separator menu. In this window, it's also possible to change the position of the labels and change the format of the numbers. As with all graphs, we can use the styles or color palettes available after clicking on the brush icon. To change the color of a slice, click on it. Don't click on the label. First, select Choose All Slices, then wait a second before selecting the chosen slice. It's marked with small circles. Then right-click on it and select the color. The changes are visible on the graph as you move the mouse cursor over the colors. To eject the slice, just select and drag it from the center of the chart. This is used to draw attention to this section. We'll just make some small corrections to the title, get rid of the graph's border, right-click Outline, No Outline. At any time, we can change the type of the chart. Let's choose the 3D pie. After right-clicking on the graph, select 3D Rotation. Now the graph can be moved in 3 dimensions. Increasing the perspective causes the graph to become harder to read, and the slice at the bottom will appear larger than it actually is. Especially for beginners, 3D graphs are tempting since they give the impression of a professional look. But in fact, the same data shown on a simpler 2D chart is much easier to read. You can find out more about this topic in the Advanced Professional Reports lesson. Creating a chart using data not in a continuous table. Nothing is stopping you from making a chart representing data that is not in a continuous table. Underneath, in the same worksheet, select the appropriate values of inventory and corresponding descriptions. To select multiple cells that are separated from each other, hold down the Control key and left-click on the cells that you want to select. If you combined the selected cells, they would create a rectangular table. Excel will not create a chart if the data arrangement is different, and you cannot create a rectangular table from the selected cells, or when the selected area contains merged cells. The result of this method will be a graph that is no different from a chart using data from a continuous table. Example 5. In a fairly simple way, the bars in the graph could use colors that correspond to their values. In this example, we'll use a different line color from January 2019, when a new general manager started working at the company. Add 2 more columns to the existing table and input the references in column D, where the data is located. In column E, only put the data from January 2018 to January 2019, and in column F, only put the data from January 2019 to December 2019. Next, select the years and months and simultaneously, using the Control key, the data with the range E2 to F26 and insert a line graph, selecting the first subtype. Then format the axis by placing the labels in a low position. Delete the horizontal grid lines so that the x-axis becomes visible, which is especially important in this case. Also add a title for the chart. Of course, the best colors for the lines are red for 2018 and green for 2019. I personally choose a thickness of 4.5. The chart is now ready, and the visual representation of the data has been enhanced by appropriate color coding. The process is similar for bar charts, as I will now show you. Since in this case, changes from plus to minus are more common, we will use the if function instead of entering references manually. If there's a value greater than 0 in cell D30, enter it into the cell. If not, simply put a 0. If there's a value below 0 in cell D30, enter it into this cell, and if not, simply put a 0. After copying the formulas into the cells below, the necessary data is ready to be translated into a graph. With the exception of column D, mark all of the data. Column headings are necessary for Excel to understand our data structure. Then insert a column chart, choosing the second subtype, stacked column. Formatting is carried out manually, like the graph from the previous example. Also, reduce the gap width. I suggest 50%. By using formulas for data changes, the table with the formulas and the graph are updated automatically. In rows 59 and 60, we have the same data divided into 3 categories. Sales decreases, sales increases up to 5%, and sales increases above 5%. I used the following formulas to calculate the division. In the formula for the numbers that are above 0 and no more than 5%, I used the logic function, and using it meant that I was able to save these two conditions simultaneously. I suggest using a sensible range of colours in the chart, since it should facilitate the understanding of the data, and more than 3 different coloured bars can make the data difficult to understand. Example 6. Sheet Graphs 6. If, when creating a graph, a piece of data is missing from the data table, or some text has been entered instead, for example, not available, or NA, it will be shown as a 0 value on the graph, which can completely distort the perception of this chart. We can change these settings by right-clicking on the graph and selecting Select Data. Then click on Hidden and Empty Cells. There are 3 options. The one that interferes with the shape of the graph the least is Connect Data Points with a Line. In this window, we can also choose whether we want to show the data from hidden columns and rows in the graph. By default, they are not shown. This solution only works for empty cells. Any text, for example, not available, will still be shown as a 0 despite those settings. Example 7. Sheet Graphs 7. Please note that the percentages shown on Excel graphs always add up to 100%. In this example, the value of category A is equal to category J, but the percentage of A is shown as 9% and J as 10%. Easily solve this problem by adding a decimal place. You can find more information about graphs in the lessons Advanced Graphs, Pivot Graph Sparkline, Graphs for Experts, and Mathematical Graphs. And finally, that's the end of that lesson. Hooray!